So here we are again, my friends, sitting right here, coffee getting cold, watching the world rearrange itself in real time. And I have to tell you, what happened in the last 10 days across the Persian Gulf, across the Strait of Hormuz, across the entire architecture of global energy, this was not just another geopolitical tremor. This was the kind of earthquake that cracks the foundation, not the walls, the foundation. Let me set the scene for you, because what mainstream Western media kept showing you, the missiles, the interceptors, the satellite footage, that was the surface. That was the Hollywood trailer. The real movie, the one nobody was screening for you, was playing out in currency trading rooms in Shanghai, in emergency meetings at the new development bank, in quiet phone calls between central bankers from Riyadh to New Delhi to Moscow. The real story was not about what was being destroyed, it was about what was being built, and it was being built fast. Here is the question that should keep every serious analyst awake at night. What happens to a global reserve currency when the very energy architecture that sustains it begins to crack? Not theoretically, not in some academic seminar in Davos, right now. In the waters between Iran and Oman, where 20% of the world's seaborne crude oil was supposed to be flowing, and wasn't. Let's rewind a little, because none of this came out of nowhere. For decades, and I mean decades, the petrodollar system has been the invisible scaffolding holding up American financial hegemony. You want to buy oil? You need dollars. You need dollars? You need to keep dollar reserves. You keep dollar reserves. You are in effect financing the American debt machine, the American military machine, and the entire ecosystem of treasury bonds that makes Wall Street the center of the known financial universe. This was the deal. This was the unwritten contract signed in the 1970s between Washington and Riyadh, and by extension, the entire Gulf. Oil flows, dollars flow, everybody stays in their lane. But here is the part that most people miss, and this is perhaps the most consequential detail of the whole arrangement. The petrodollar was never just about money. It was about control. It was about the ability to say to any country on earth, you want energy? You play by our rules, you settle in our currency, you use our banking system, you submit to our sanctions regime, or you freeze in the dark. For a long time, this worked. It worked because there was no alternative. There was no other currency liquid enough, no other financial infrastructure deep enough, no other military powerful enough to guarantee the sea lanes. The dollar was not just a currency, it was a civilization's operating system. Now here comes the part of the story that nobody in Washington wants you to hear. The Strait of Hormuz crisis did not just disrupt oil supplies. It disrupted the narrative. It disrupted the myth that the dollar-denominated energy system was somehow eternal, somehow invulnerable, somehow the only game in town. Because when that narrow waterway, 21 miles at its slimmest point, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the wider world, when that artery effectively shut down, something extraordinary happened. The world did not end, but the world did start looking for other roads. Think about this for a moment. Tanker traffic through Hormuz dropped to almost zero within days. Countries that depend on Gulf energy, and we are talking about 70% of all shipments heading to Asia, to China, India, Japan, South Korea, these countries suddenly found themselves staring at a supply vacuum. Oil prices shot past $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. European natural gas futures spiked by 30% after Qatar halted its LNG production. The world's energy bloodstream was clotting in real time. And what did the so-called guardians of the global order offer? An American president posted on social media that the U.S. Navy would escort tankers if necessary. Insurance guarantees from a development finance corporation. In other words, a band-aid on a hemorrhage. Because the fundamental issue was not about escort ships or insurance policies. The fundamental issue was that the entire energy supply chain, the chain that underpins the dollar's reserve status, was revealed to be hostage to a single geographic choke point controlled by the very forces that the dollar system had spent decades trying to contain. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. And I want you to stay with me here, because this is the thread that connects everything. From Hormuz to BRICS, from oil tankers to digital currencies, from the Strait to the future of money itself. While Western capitals were busy managing the crisis on the military front, something else was accelerating far from the camera lights. The Dedollarization agenda, which for years had been dismissed by Western economists as a fantasy, a pipe dream, a global South delusion, suddenly had its most powerful accelerant in history. Not a speech, not a summit declaration, not a white paper from a think tank, a real, tangible, visceral energy crisis that demonstrated in the most brutal way possible the fragility of a system built on a single currency and a single choke point. Let's talk about what has actually been happening on the de-dollarization front, because the media environment has been so saturated with wartime imagery that the financial revolution unfolding underneath has been almost completely ignored. Russia and China have settled over 99% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. Read that number again. 99%. This is not an aspiration. This is not a pilot program. This is a fait accompli. The two largest land powers on the Eurasian continent have effectively built a parallel financial universe that does not require a single dollar to function. The BRICS Pay system, connecting Russia's SPFS, China's CIPS, and India's UPI, has already reduced dollar usage in intra-block trade by roughly two-thirds. The BRICS unit, a settlement tool backed by 40% gold and 60% BRICS currencies, launched its pilot program and has begun facilitating cross-border transactions that bypass the dollar entirely. And here is the kicker. The thing that connects the Hormuz crisis directly to this financial transformation. When the Strait shut down, the countries most desperately affected were the ones most dependent on dollar-denominated energy markets. Japan, South Korea, European nations importing LNG. These are all deep inside the dollar ecosystem. Their energy contracts are priced in dollars. Their shipping insurance is denominated in dollars. Their hedging instruments are all dollar-based. When Hormuz closed, they did not just lose access to oil and gas, they lost confidence in the infrastructure that was supposed to guarantee that access. Meanwhile, the countries that had been building alternatives, the ones dismissed as dreamers and disruptors, found themselves in a remarkably different position. China, which had been quietly diversifying its energy sources and settlement mechanisms for years, was able to continue receiving some shipments through the strait because Iranian authorities allowed Chinese-flagged vessels to pass, not American vessels, not European vessels, Chinese vessels. Think about the symbolism of that for a moment. In the middle of the worst energy choke point crisis in modern history, the only non-Iranian ships still moving through Hormuz were flying the flag of the country that had built an alternative financial architecture. This was not an accident. This was the result of years of strategic preparation. The Belt and Road Initiative, the energy partnerships, the currency swap agreements, the slow but deliberate construction of a financial ecosystem that could operate independently of Western control. What the Hormuz crisis did was compress a decade of gradual change into a single dramatic demonstration. Now, I want to be precise here because the temptation in moments like these is to declare the death of the dollar and move on. That would be lazy analysis, and lazy analysis is something I have no patience for, whether it comes from Western triumphalists or from multipolar cheerleaders. The dollar is not dead. The dollar is not dying tomorrow. The dollar remains the most liquid currency on earth, the backbone of the deepest capital markets ever created, and the default settlement currency for the vast majority of global trade. These are structural advantages that cannot be replicated overnight, no matter how many BRICS summits are held or how many blockchain payment systems are launched. But, and this is the crucial but, the dollar's position has shifted from unassailable to contestable. And in geopolitics, as in nature, once something becomes contestable, the erosion begins, slowly at first, then all at once. What the Hormuz crisis revealed was not that the dollar is finished. It revealed that the dollar's hegemony depends on a set of physical, military, and institutional guarantees that are no longer as reliable as they once were. When the world's most important energy choke point can be effectively shut down for days on end, with oil surging past $110 a barrel, with producers shutting in production, with global supply chains seizing up, the implicit promise of the dollar system, which is we guarantee the flow of energy in exchange for your continued use of our currency, that promise rings hollow. And this is where we need to talk about Mackinder, not because I want to give you a geopolitics lecture, although, let's be honest, a little Mackinder never hurt anybody, but because what we are witnessing is the vindication of the Heartland thesis in its most modern form. Halford Mackinder, writing at the dawn of the 20th century, argued that whoever controlled the Eurasian landmass, the Heartland, would control the world. For over a century, maritime powers, first Britain and then America, maintained dominance by controlling the sea lanes, the choke points, the oceans that connected global trade. The dollar itself was, in many ways, a maritime currency, its power projected through aircraft carriers and naval bases, its value guaranteed by the ability to keep the seas open and the oil flowing. But what if the sea lanes become unreliable? What if the choke points become contested? What if the energy trade begins to flow overland, through pipelines, through railways, through the very heartland routes that the maritime powers spent a century trying to prevent? This is exactly what has been happening. The power of Siberia pipeline connecting Russian gas to China, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the international north-south transport corridor linking Russia, Iran, and India, the expanding rail connections between China and Europe through Central Asia. Every one of these projects is a nail in the coffin of the maritime dollar nexus, because every barrel of oil and every cubic meter of gas that flows overland is a barrel and a cubic meter that does not need to pass through Hormuz, does not need to be priced in dollars, does not need to be insured by Lloyd's of London, and does not need to pay tribute to the financial architecture of the Potomac. The Hormuz crisis did not create this trend, but it supercharged it. It gave every energy minister, every central banker, every logistics planner in the global south a concrete, visceral reason to accelerate the transition, not because they hate the dollar, although some of them certainly do, but because they discovered, in the most painful way possible, that dependence on a single maritime choke point and a single currency is an existential vulnerability. Now, let me take you to another layer of this story, because the financial dimension is only part of the puzzle. There is a deeper structural shift happening, and it has to do with the nature of power itself. For the past 80 years, since Bretton Woods in 1944, the global financial system has been essentially unipolar. One country issues the reserve currency. One country sets the monetary policy that the rest of the world has to adapt to. One country can weaponize its financial system through sanctions, through swift exclusions, through asset freezes to punish anyone who steps out of line. This was the architecture that Harry Dexter White built against the objections of John Maynard Keynes, who had proposed something far more equitable, a multilateral clearing union based on a neutral unit of account he called the Bancor. Keynes lost that argument in 1944 because Britain was broke and America was ascendant. But here is the delicious irony of history. 80 years later, the very forces that Keynes warned about, the asymmetry of a system based on a single national currency, the exorbitant privilege that allows the issuer to run perpetual deficits while the rest of the world bears the adjustment costs, these forces are now creating the conditions for exactly the kind of multilateral alternative that Keynes envisioned. The BRICS nations, for all their internal contradictions, and believe me, there are many, have stumbled onto a fundamental truth. You cannot build a multipolar world on top of a unipolar financial system. The two are incompatible. If the global south is serious about strategic autonomy, about the right to trade with whoever they want, to invest in whatever they choose, to pursue their own development models without fear of financial punishment, they need a financial architecture that reflects the multipolar reality of production, consumption, and power. This does not mean a single BRICS currency. India has made it very clear that it has no interest in creating a shared currency dominated by Beijing. Brazil is cautious, South Africa has its own constraints. The diversity within BRICS is in many ways its greatest strength and its greatest challenge simultaneously. What it does mean is a web of bilateral and multilateral settlement mechanisms, currency swaps, digital payment platforms, commodity-backed units of account that collectively reduce the global economy's dependence on the dollar without requiring anyone to abandon the dollar entirely. Think of it as building parallel roads. You do not need to blow up the highway to make it less relevant. You just need to offer enough alternative routes that traffic naturally disperses. And here is what makes the current moment so different from all the previous rounds of de-dollarization talk. This time, the alternatives are not just theoretical, they are operational. BRICS Pay is processing transactions. CIPS is handling cross-border settlements. Central bank digital currencies are being tested in pilot programs across the bloc. The new development bank is issuing loans in local currencies. Russia and China are trading energy in their own currencies at scale. India is paying for Russian oil in rupees. The infrastructure exists. It is imperfect, it is fragmented, it is not yet anywhere close to matching SWIFT's global reach, but it exists. And then along comes the Hormuz crisis, and suddenly every country in Asia, every oil importing nation in Africa, every energy dependent economy in South America is asking the same question. Why are we still running 100% of our energy trade through a system that can be shut down by a conflict in a 21-mile wide waterway? The answer, increasingly, is we should not be, and we do not have to be. Now, I want to add a note of caution here because I have been covering these dynamics for a long time, from Tehran to Shanghai to Sao Paulo, and I have learned that the gap between aspiration and execution in the global south can be enormous. De-dollarization is not a light switch. You cannot flip it on and off. It is a process, a long, messy, politically fraught process that involves redesigning everything from trade invoicing to reserve management to the legal frameworks that govern international contracts. Countries that hold trillions of dollars in reserves cannot simply dump them without crashing their own balance sheets. Companies that have dollar-denominated debt cannot simply switch to yuan payments without triggering a cascade of defaults. The plumbing of global finance is built on the dollar, and you cannot rip out the plumbing while the house is still standing. But what you can do, and what is happening right now, accelerated by the Hormuz crisis, is build new plumbing alongside the old. You can start settling marginal transactions in alternative currencies. You can build up gold reserves as a hedge. You can create digital infrastructure that allows for instant, low-cost cross-border payments without touching the SWIFT system. You can negotiate bilateral agreements that allow energy trade in local currencies. You can, in short, reduce the dollar's share of your economic life from 90% to 70%, and then to 50%, and then to whatever level you are comfortable with. This is what de-risking looks like in the financial domain. It is not about killing the dollar. It is about reducing your vulnerability to a system that has been repeatedly weaponized against countries that the dollar's issuer considers adversaries. And this brings us back to the Heartland and to the great chessboard that Zbigniew Brzezinski once described as the key to global power, because what we are witnessing is not just a financial shift, it is a geographic shift. A shift from the maritime Atlantic axis that has dominated global trade for 5 centuries to the overland Eurasian networks that predate Columbus, that predate Vasco da Gama, that go all the way back to the original Silk Roads. The Belt and Road Initiative is the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. Whatever you think of Beijing's motivations, and there is plenty to debate, the physical reality of new ports, railways, pipelines, fiber optic cables, and logistics hubs stretching from the South China Sea to the Mediterranean is undeniable. This is not soft power. This is concrete steel and fiber optic cable power. And every new route that comes online is a route that reduces the world's dependence on the maritime choke points, Hormuz, Malacca, Suez, that have been the pillars of Western strategic dominance. The international north-south transport corridor, linking Mumbai to Moscow through Iran, is another piece of this puzzle. When it reaches full capacity, it will allow goods to move between India and Russia in roughly half the time it takes by the traditional sea route. The Trans-Caspian route connecting China to Turkey through Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan is yet another. Each of these corridors is a thread in a new web of connectivity that makes the old maritime monopoly increasingly obsolete. What does all of this have to do with the dollar? Everything. Because the dollar's reserve status was built on a world where maritime trade was the only game in town, where controlling the sea lanes meant controlling commerce, where the navy that ruled the waves also ruled the currencies, in a world where overland trade routes are multiplying, where digital payments can bypass traditional banking networks, where energy can flow through pipelines that no aircraft carrier can patrol. In that world, the structural foundations of dollar hegemony are being quietly eroded. The Hormuz crisis was a flashing neon sign pointing to this reality. It said, in letters visible from Tokyo to Berlin, your entire energy security depends on a narrow strip of water that can be shut down by a regional conflict. Your entire financial system is denominated in a currency whose value depends on the stability of that strip of water. How comfortable does that make you feel? The answer, judging by the scramble for alternatives that has intensified since last week, is not very comfortable at all. So where does this leave us? What is the big picture? The big picture is this. We are living through the end of the unipolar financial moment. Not the end of the dollar, and let me say that again, for those who love binary narratives, but the end of the dollar's unchallenged monopoly. We are moving toward a world of multiple reserve currencies, multiple settlement systems, multiple financial architectures competing and coexisting, a world where the dollar is still the biggest player at the table but no longer the only player, where alternatives exist, imperfect as they may be, where the ability to sanction, to freeze, to exclude is constrained by the availability of other channels. This is, in many ways, a return to the historical norm. For most of human history, the global economy operated on multiple currencies, multiple trade networks, multiple centers of gravity. The unipolar dollar moment, roughly 1944 to the early 2020s, was the anomaly, not the rule. What we are witnessing is the world reverting to its natural state of multipolarity, not just in military power, but in financial power. The question, and this is the question I want to leave you with because it is the question that will define the next decade, is whether this transition will be managed or chaotic, whether the existing powers will accommodate the shift, negotiate new rules, create space for emerging financial architectures, or whether they will resist, sanction, coerce, and ultimately trigger the very crisis of confidence in the dollar that they are trying to prevent. Because here is the ultimate paradox. The more aggressively the dollar is weaponized, through sanctions, through swift exclusions, through asset freezes, through trade wars, the more incentive the rest of the world has to build alternatives. Every sanction package is a marketing brochure for CIPS. Every swift exclusion is a recruitment pitch for BRICS Pay. Every frozen asset is a motivation to hold reserves in gold instead of treasuries. The Hormuz crisis was many things. A military operation, a regional catastrophe, an energy shock. But in the longer arc of history, it may be remembered as the moment when the world's confidence in the dollar-energy nexus cracked in a way that could not be patched over with presidential tweets and insurance guarantees. The bells are not yet tolling for the dollar, but they are warming up. And for anyone who thinks the sound is too distant to matter, I would suggest listening more carefully. Because from where I sit with this cold coffee and a map of the world that looks nothing like it did even a month ago, from right here, those bells are getting louder by the day. The old order is not gone, but the new one is no longer just a rumor whispered in the corridors of BRICS summits. It is being wired, plumbed, and coded into existence, one transaction at a time, one pipeline at a time, one currency swap at a time. And the question that hangs over everything, the question that keeps the smartest minds in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi awake, is not whether the change is coming. It is whether anyone is ready for it. That is the question that stays with us. And that, my friends, is where we will pick up next time.